Okay, so now we're on part two of this topic, which would be everyday memories and memory errors. So we now continue on the constructive nature of memory. So we have seen that we remember certain things better than others because they may hold special significance, or it may be when it happened in our lives. So like we mentioned before, like during the teenage years, or it could be emotionally intense, so that's why we could recall the event or the experience. But we have also seen that what people remember may not always match what actually happened. And that actually reflects the characteristics of memory, meaning that it's a constructive nature, right? The constructive nature of memory is like what people report as memories are constructed based on what actually happened, but additional information like their prior knowledge, their experiences, and even their expectations. Now, this could be demonstrated by Bartlett's experiment, War of the Ghost, where he had participants attempt to remember a story from a different culture. He then engaged in repeated reproduction. So repeated reproduction is where participants would is a technique used where participants are asked to remember the story at longer and longer intervals after they first read it. This is similar to repeated recall that's used in flashbulb memory experiments. And what they found is that over time, the actual reproduction of the story um, or during the reproduction or repeated reproduction, the participants' versions of the story became shorter. It contained omissions, meaning they left out information, and there were some inaccuracies. And what was actually interesting is that the participants modified the story a bit to be more consistent with their own culture. So here we see their individuals like put past knowledge, prior knowledge, experiences, and or their expectations influencing their recall of memory. Now, the issues or errors that persons may have when recalling memories could deal with the source of the memory. Now, a source memory is the process of determining the origins of our memories. And the error here could be misidentifying the actual source of the memory, which is called source misattribution or the monitoring error. Well, source monitoring errors are called source misattributions because the memory is attributed to the wrong source. It provides an example of the constructive nature of memory because when we remember something, we retrieve the memory as I remember becoming interested in seeing that movie, or I remember being interested about a particular event, and then we determine where the memory came from, right? We're not sure where we got that interest from. So was it from a friend telling us about the movie? It was about a review that we saw online. So the actual source of the information could be incorrect or misattributed. Now, some of the more sensational examples of source monitoring errors is cases of cryptomnesia, where persons may unconsciously plagiarize the work of others. So persons may take or assume someone else's work and misattribute the origins of the work to something that they did for themselves when it's actually someone else's work they're plagiarizing. Now, an experiment by Jacobi and colleagues demonstrated an effect of source monitoring errors by testing participants' ability to distinguish between famous and non-famous names. So in the acquisition part of the experiment, they had subjects read a number of made-up non-famous names like Sebastian Weisdorf and Valerie Marsh. And for the immediate test group, participants were tested immediately after seeing a list of non-famous names. They were then told to pick out the names of famous people from the list. So they had different like stages in the experiment. So one was the asked persons identify the non-famous names that they had just seen, identify new non-famous names that they had never seen before, and then famous names that many people might have recognized during that time period. Now, just before the test, participants were reminded that all of the names they had seen in the first part of the experiment were non-famous. And because the test was administered shortly after the participants had seen the first list of non-famous names, they actually correctly identified most of the old non-famous names as being non-famous. Now, the explanation for this finding is that some of the non-famous names were seen as familiar, and the participants misattributed the source of the familiarity. So they misattributed where they got the information from, indicating that these people were not famous. So they failed to identify the source as the list that they had read previously. And this is just a diagram illustrating the experiment, right? So in the acquisition phase, they had to read non-famous names. And then in the immediate test group, they read non-famous names from acquisition, plus new non-famous names and new famous names. And they were asked which were famous. And then in the delayed test group, they waited 24 hours and received the same instructions. So read non-famous names from the acquisition, plus new non-famous names and famous names. So the result with the delayed test group is that some non-famous names were misidentified as famous. Okay, so now we have a little demonstration. So what I want you all to do is to read the following sentences. So the 5 sentences on the screen. I'll give you a moment. Okay. Now I want you to fill in the blanks with the words that you just read. Okay. So this brings us to another issue, which is making inferences. So our memories could be influenced by inferences that we make based on our past experience and knowledge. But it's important to do the demonstration that we saw before and test to see how accurate your answers were for the fill in the blank. Now, this demonstration is in your text also. And for the sentences that we have previously, the most common errors that people typically have is that they interchange words or use different words or make inferences, right? So for the word vanish, they may use the word melted, weaken, they typically use collapsed, didn't have became lost, hit became broke or smashed, and stayed awake became cried. Now, these changes in words illustrate the process called pragmatic inference, which occurs when reading a sentence leads person to expect something that is not explicitly stated or implied by the sentence. These inferences are typically based on knowledge gained through past experiences. Thus, although reading that a baby stayed awake all night does not include any information about the baby crying, our previous knowledge about babies might lead persons to infer that a baby was actually crying. Right? So if that makes sense, right? So um, at, at any when we receive information or we are reading information, we tend to make inferences based on our past experience. So we may only receive part of a picture or a story, but we tend to automatically try to fill in the gaps and add information and infer from what is stated. So why does this happen? Right, this could happen, or this occurs due to our schemas and scripts. So a schema is knowledge about some aspect in the environment. For example, a person's schema of a post office might include what a post office building looks like, what it looks like from the inside, what it looks like outside, and what services that post office provides. And how do we develop schemas? Well, we develop schemas through our experience in different situations. So we would have an idea of what the post office looks like from the outside or the inside and what they do by visiting a post office. Same thing in terms of any aspect. So going to class in a lecture, you would have a schema of that based on probably what you saw on TV and also your experience attending lectures. Same thing with a sporting game like a football game or a doctor's waiting room. So another example of how schemas can lead to erroneous decisions in memory experiments have involved a schema type, specifically a script. So a script essentially is our conception of a sequence of actions that usually occurs during the particular experience. For example, we will have a particular script of playing, let's say, tennis or going to a restaurant. We have particular expectations that if you go to a restaurant where you need to dine in, you may go to this the custodian and the front desk, let them know your reservation. They will sit you, a waiter will come to you and give you the menu for you to give you some time to decide. And then they will come back to take your order and so on and so on, right? So we tend to have a concept or a sequence of actions that we anticipate or expect, and that is usually based on prior experience. The issue here is that schemas and scripts tend to influence our memory. So our memory in that instance can include information that is not actually experienced, but inferred because it is what we expected or what is consistent with the schema. So for example, if it is that we're looking at an office waiting room, even though there may not be books in that office waiting room, we may, when recalling what or describing the room, we may say that there are books present because we expect there to be books in the office waiting room. And due to the constructive nature of memories, right, and the nature of schemas and scripts, this can lead to false memories, right? So our expectations of what an event is or our schemas will influence or corrode our memories. Now, there's some advantages to this making inferences, right? So when we make inferences based on information, it allows us to fill in blanks, right? So like to beef up a story or add to it to get a comprehensive idea of it or understanding. And it's important to know that our cognition is very creative because it helps us to understand language and solve problems and make decisions. But the drawbacks to that is that sometimes you may make errors and sometimes you may misattribute the source of information. So we may not look at what was actually presented, but what inferences that we may make from it. Now, in a typical memory experiment, a person could see or hear some stimuli such as words, letters, or sentences, observe pictures or a film of the event and ask to report what they experienced, right? But what if the experimenters were to add additional information? They were asking the person, like what the person would have remembered. Now, Lufus and colleagues, they asked in a series of pioneering experiments that established the misinformation effect. So essentially, they misled or provided misleading information two participants after witnessing an event, and they show how that could change how a person describes an event later. So this misleading information is referred to as the misleading post-event information. So essentially, misinformation effect is offering misleading information after a person's witnessing an event and examining how that could change the person's description of the event. So in the experiment, we see the power of suggestion. For some colleagues presented slides of a traffic accident with a stop sign, and then introduced that misinformed post-event information. And what they found is that participants remembered what they heard, which was the introduction of the yield sign, and not what they saw, which would have been a stop sign, right? So their recollection of the event was revised due to the power of suggestion. Later experiment by Lucas and Palmer showed that in presenting a car accident, again, an image to participants, when persons got a description of the accident, they heard smash or hit, and that's the misleading information. And they found that those who heard smashed said the cars were actually going much faster than those who heard the word hit. That's because smash may have more implications for how intense the crash was, right? And then persons later inferred that the drivers were going much faster based on that information. Now, one explanation for this effect is due to retroactive interference, right? Now, we covered retroactive interference before, but this occurs when more recent learning infers or interferes with memory for something that happened in the past or the actual event. For example, retroactive interference would be involved if studying for your, say, French exam made it more difficult to remember some of the vocabulary words that you studied for your Spanish exam earlier in the day. So similar as to how retroactive interference could affect learning, exposure to misinformed post-event information could actually interfere with remembering what actually happened when person originally viewed the stimulus. Another explanation for the misinformation effect is based on the idea of source monitoring, which we talked about earlier in, I think in part 1. So for source monitoring perspective, a person we know incorrectly concludes that the source of the memory for the incorrect event was, for example, a slideshow, even if the actual source was the experimenter's statement after the slideshow. We see our diagram illustrating the power of suggestion, right? So in Lindsay experiment, you have participants hear a story, and 2 days later again, with some details changed, they were told to ignore the changes. And in experiments where the same voice of both stories, they was more likely to create source monitoring errors. However, when they change the voice, so there's a distinction in terms of who the source is, so the persons had a cue or difference to distinguish the sources, you realize that persons did not create as many errors. Now we can look at false memories. So Hyman, Jr. and colleagues created false memories for long ago events in an experiment in which they contacted the parents of their participants and asked them to provide descriptions of actual events that happened when the participants were children. They also created descriptions of false events, like events that never happened, such as a birthday party that included a clown and pizza, or filling a bowl of punch in a wedding reception. So what they found is that when discussing it later, the participant remember the new events or the revised events as actually happened, as actually happening. And hearing about the event and then waiting caused the event to emerge as a false memory. And now we go back to what we talked about in the beginning of the lecture, which is eyewitness testimony and errors we could have in eyewitness testimony. So eyewitness testimony or testimony by eyewitnesses to a crime, I should say, eyewitness testimony is where you have a witness describing or testifying about a crime which they would have seen. It is one of the most convincing types of evidence that is presented to a jury because persons tend to assume that people could recall an event accurately. But as we know, there are many errors in memory recollection, right? But like any other form of memories, we know that eyewitness testimony could be inaccurate because at times persons could mistake the identity of the person, and due to the constructive nature of memories, the fact that it includes the actual event plus our expectations and past experiences, there may be errors in eyewitness testimony. Now we can look at this experiment by Wells and Bradfield. And in this experiment, participants viewed security videotape with a gunman for 8 seconds. And everyone identified someone as a gunman from the photographs afterwards, when in fact the actual gunman's picture was not presented to the participants. Now, this has serious implications for crime, right? Crime detection. Because when a crime occurs, how the evidence is collected, typically we know that there will be like forensic techniques, fingerprinting, they might have bullet analysis, DNA analysis, and a host of like more objective physical measures. But still, even with our understanding of memories and how they could be constructed and their errors, eyewitness testimony is still significant for jury members, right? Now, the acceptance of eyewitness testimony is typically based on two assumptions. One, the eyewitness is able to clearly see and see what happened, and also the eyewitness is able to remember their observations and translate them in an accurate description of what happened, and accurately identify the perpetrator. However, persons tend to make errors due to attention to detail and a level of arousal, right? Now, one example of this would be the weapons effect. So we see that anxiety tends to interfere with memory. So Lofus and colleagues showed participants 2 films, one involving a gun and one not. And they found that memory for details unrelated to the gun was poorer in the film involving the gun. This is called the weapon focus effect. This is called the weapon focus effect. A later researcher suggested that people attended to stimuli that are unexpected in the current situation, and this tends to impair memory. So persons are attending to the gun or the weapon, I should say, in the film, and that kind of disturbs or distorts their memory. Now, Deffenbacher and colleagues found that when persons have to report culprits or perpetrators of a crime, they found that persons were able to identify more often the details of low anxiety situations than high anxiety situations. So it seems that our heightened levels of anxiety tends to interfere with memory. So it's used with eyewitness testimony again, but apply to what we discussed before, right? So errors due to familiarity and source monitoring. So they're unsure where the source of information came from. It could also be affected by suggestive questioning. So, for example, if a witness is questioned by an officer using the term like which one of these men did it, that is very suggestive in terms of it suggests that one of the men from this list did it, and it's not the possibility that it's someone who's not from this list. So typically, officers are trained to provide or to give neutral questioning rather than leading questioning or suggestive questioning. Also, another error could be the misinformation effect or the post-identification feedback effect. And this is where jurors are strongly influenced by how confident an eyewitness is about their judgment. So the confidence that an eyewitness may have in terms of retelling a story tends to skew the juror's perception. And they also tend to believe what the eyewitness is saying because of that. So as we were saying before, errors in eyewitness testimony, typically confidence in the witness's memory may increase by post-event questioning because the memory is then brought from long-term memory into working memory and revised. And it also makes memories easier to retrieve, right? Because there's the like the rehearsal of the information or the memory. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this topic. I will post notes, although there's a video, I'll post notes and practice multiple choice questions for you all later in the week.